For 2 long, freezing days and nights, 132 men were stranded on an ice field floating in the North Atlantic, thinly dressed, with no food nor shelter against the cold. This is the story of those that made it out alive, and of those who had to remain in the snow. The 1914 sealing disaster. In Canada, seal hunting began long before the arrival of the first European explorers. It is estimated that First Nations and Inuit in Canada had been hunting seals for at least 4,000 years. This practice would then be observed by the Europeans arriving on Canada's shores. Shortly thereafter, Europeans arriving in Newfoundland began sealing themselves. By 1723, large-scale commercial seal hunting had become an annual event and would continue expanding rapidly. The first regions to experience large-scale sealing was Labrador, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and Newfoundland. In Newfoundland, the spring seal fishery began in the 1790s. During the months of March and April, fishermen in small boats and schooners would go out to hunt among the ice floes. The industry peaked in the 1840s. As business was booming, more powerful, bigger and reliable steamships, capable of withstanding the pressures of the ice and with a greater storing capacity, soon replaced the smaller schooners. From the 1870s onward, annual catches often exceeded the 400,000 mark. Even so, the industry had begun to decline somewhat in the 1860s. One possible explanation for this is the dangers of the work. For instance, sealing ships had to steam into the dangerous ice floes to find their catch. This meant that they had to contend with large frozen masses of floating seawater and southern blizzards. This, of course, added the risk of ships getting stuck in the ice or having their hulls crushed. Then, you had the added dangers of possible fire, explosions, or drownings if anyone went through the ice. In addition to that, men had to step on the ice to hunt the seals, spending up to 12 hours on the ice with little food, no shelter, and wearing clothing that were ill-suited for the conditions that they were facing. They also had to walk for miles to reach any seals, as they couldn't just bring the ship up right on top of the seals, meaning that if the weather were to worsen, the men had to fight their way back through that worsening weather. This meant that many lives, as well as ships, would be lost due to these conditions. But by far, the worst of these incidents occurred in 1914. The 1914 sealing disaster is marked by 2 events that combined would claim the lives of 251 men. The disasters of the SS Newfoundland and the SS Southern Cross. Both ships were part of the sealing fleet that left St. John's for the North Atlantic icefields on March 13, 1914. The SS Southern Cross was a steam-powered sealing vessel that operated primarily in Norway and Newfoundland. She took part in every seal hunt from 1901 to 1914. Her hunt this time had been successful and she was reportedly on her way back. On track to be the first ship to return to port that year. The Southern Cross would reportedly be spotted on her way back at least twice. The Evening Telegram writes on April 3, 1914 that nothing has been heard of the Southern Cross since she was reported off Cape Pine on Tuesday last, and the general opinion is that she was driven far off to sea. Various reports were afloat in the city last night, one in particular that she had passed Cape Race yesterday afternoon. But upon making inquiries, this and the other reports were unfortunately found to be untrue. What exactly happened to the Southern Cross is unclear, as no crewmen or record of the voyage survived. The official verdict is that the ship sank in a blizzard on March 31st, but there is little evidence to verify this. And because of the lack of evidence, rumors and theories about what happened would quickly pop up. One such theory was that the ship's heavy cargo would contribute to the accident. Another rumor said that the ship had rotten boards, which gave out in the heavy sea. This in turn allowed the cargo to shift and capsize the steamer. But these are of course just theories because we have no way of knowing for sure. All we know is that the SS Southern Cross would disappear, taking the lives of 174 men. But before concern could even begin to be expressed about the Southern Cross's absence, there was a good deal of attention divided in another direction. Because by the time people started worrying about the Southern Cross, they had already heard news of a disaster that had befallen the crew of the SS Newfoundland. One half of the disaster, known as the 1914 Newfoundland sealing disaster, the loss of life on the Southern Cross may have been greater than that on the other half of the disaster. But many historians argue that the other half, which is the loss of the SS Newfoundland, had a greater emotional impact on those that heard the story. Simply because, in this case, there were survivors to tell their harrowing story. Like the Southern Cross, the SS Newfoundland would leave St. John's for the North Atlantic icefields on March 13, 1914. It was under the command of Captain Westbury Keane, who was accompanied by his father Abraham Keane, who was the captain of the SS Stefano. Father and son had agreed to alert the other of any seals that they would spot during the hunt, despite the fact that they were working for different companies. On March 13th, the Stefano signaled that there were seals several miles away. By that point, the Newfoundland had gotten trapped in the ice of the northern coast of Newfoundland. By that point, the Newfoundland had gotten trapped in the ice, unable to cut through the thick ice or even freeing the ship from its trapped position. Westbury ordered his men off the ship the following morning. Under the overall command of the second hand, George Tuff, the men set out in the direction of the Stefano around 7 a.m. Their orders were to begin hunting seals. Westbury did not anticipate bad weather as the morning was mild. Still, if the weather were to worsen, Westbury had ordered the men to go aboard the Stefano. Westbury figured that his men should spend the night on the Stefano or another ship called the Floricelle, which was also supposed to be nearby. But this intention was either not communicated properly or completely misunderstood by the crew, because as far as George Tuff knew, he was only supposed to travel to the Stefano and then take orders from Captain Abram. A few hours after departing, there were signs of an approaching storm, which many of the sailors recognized. This led to talk of the weather, and that talk would eventually lead to 34 men deciding to turn back and return to the ship, not wanting to risk getting caught in a storm. But the rest of the group would forge ahead. By around 11:20 a.m., the remaining 132 men would reach the Stefano and were welcomed aboard, where they were offered lunch and a very brief rest. The Stefano then moved to a pack of seals that was 2 miles to the south, after which Captain Abram ordered the Newfoundland crew off his ship, with instructions to kill 1,500 seals before returning to their own ship. This was despite the fact that by this point, there were clear signs that the weather was getting worse. But even so, Captain Abram did not offer the men any shelter for the night. After dropping the men off, the Stefano left. 132 men now found themselves standing on the ice, tired from a 4-hour trek in a thickening storm that left them unable to see their own ship. A ship they were apparently expected to reach, despite having no idea which direction the Stefano had taken them in, or which direction the Newfoundland even was. Tuff would tell the men that they should follow Captain Abram's orders, which meant walking in the opposite direction of the Stefano to kill seals. By 12:45, the wind was kicking up so much snow that the sailors were forced to stop hunting and try to reach their own ship, despite still not knowing where it was. Captain Abram had made a mistake when he dropped the men off. He had misjudged the direction, which left the sailors off course and further away from their own ship than they thought. So now, left with no other choice, the men walked through knee-deep snowdrifts and across wheeling ice pans until it had grown dark, at which point Tuff ordered them to build shelters from loose chunks of ice. Unfortunately, this did not help against shifting winds, sudden ice storms, and plummeting temperatures. The storm that hit the men that day was the worst storm to hit Newfoundland that winter. So bad, in fact, that the 34 men that originally abandoned the trek to return to the ship only managed to find the ship by following the vessel's whistle. There was no way for the Newfoundland to communicate with the other ship or any other ship. The wireless telegraph equipment that they could have used to communicate had been removed by the owner because they viewed it as an unnecessary expense. To them, communication was only useful if it resulted in an improved hunt. They didn't think of it as something used for safety. Both Captain Westbury and Captain Abram presumed that the men were safe aboard the other's ship. Because of this, neither man made any attempt to locate the crew or even try to guide them towards the ship by sounding the ship's whistle through the night. For the men on the ice, the night had been nothing short of horrific. By morning, there were several men scattered all over the ice, either dead or dying. The remaining men tried once again to locate their ship, most of them barely able to walk, their limbs frozen and numb. They spent the next day trying to reach the Newfoundland, but with no luck. Some of the men would accidentally walk into the ice-cold waters and drown. Another ship, the Bonaventure, would come close to a spot where the men were, but it did not see them. The Stefano would also get close to the men without seeing them. And to make matters worse, the Newfoundland had finally broken loose from the ice and quickly moved away from the area, not realizing that by this point, a few of the crew were only about 2 miles away from them. But the Newfoundland did not get far before it ended up stuck in the ice once again. The men on the ice were still trapped and had to spend another miserable night on the ice. The following morning, several of the survivors, still able, set out for the Newfoundland. By this point, the ship had not gotten loose from the ice yet, so Captain Westbury had climbed up to the barrel. He was studying the Stefano through his binoculars before swinging the glass around to survey the ice floes. It was then that he spotted several men staggering across the ice toward the ship. Realizing with horror just what he was looking at, the captain slid down to the deck and informed the crew before he ran off to use an improvised distress signal to alert the other vessels within the fleet. The Stefano did see this signal, and Captain Abram dispatched men to find out what was going on. Once the full horror of the men's situation was revealed, crewmen from the Stefano and the SS Floricel stepped onto the ice to search for the remaining men. The remaining survivors, as well as the men who died during the ordeal, would be rescued by the Bonaventure, who had remained in the vicinity. Out of 132 men left stranded on the ice, 77 would die, with many more seriously injured. Only 69 bodies were recovered. The rest had most likely fallen into the water. News of the disaster would reach St. John's by telegraph on the evening of April 2nd. It would then quickly spread across the country. The Evening Telegraph reported that people seemed unable to work after news of the disaster had reached them. Letters of sympathy were printed by local newspapers, who had also received donations from people wishing to help victims and their families. When the Bonaventure arrived in port on April 4th, hundreds of spectators lined the St. John's waterfront. The sight of the 69 men the ship was carrying sent a shudder through the crowd, according to the Evening Telegram. The crowd watched for hours as the injured and the dead left the Bonaventure. The survivors would be brought to St. John's for medical care, where one more man would pass away, bringing the death toll of the SS Newfoundland to 78. Photographs from the arrival of the Bonaventure as well as stories of the disaster would circulate throughout the country. People began expressing concern over the dangers that sealers faced. Many would also question the existing regulations governing the hunt. The news of the loss of the SS Southern Cross, which brought the total death toll up to 251, only increased public scrutiny concerning the hunting of seals. Hundreds of families had lost their loved ones, their breadwinners. Many of the smaller communities where the sealers lived also suffered in the short term from a damaged economy, not to mention the declining morale left in the wake of the losses. Anger would also be directed at Captain Abraham Keene. Many held him morally responsible for the dead and injured sealers of the Newfoundland. People would write letters that arrived at local newspapers, criticizing Keene for leaving the sealers on the ice. On the 5th of March 1915, the Mail and Advocate would publish a petition that demanded that the police charge Keene with criminal negligence, and that petition collected 6,000 signatures within a week. Keene would sue the paper for defamation, and he would win the case, but people remained unsympathetic towards him. Protesters demanded his retirement, but were unsuccessful. Keene also faced criticism from other sealers, many of whom refused to work with him and expressed that he should not return to the ice. Despite this, Abram Keene would continue sealing for 20 years before finally retiring in 1936. Despite his successes as a sealing captain afterwards, many still held a negative view of him for his involvement in the 1914 disaster. An inquiry into the disaster was held in 1915 to examine both the Newfoundland and the Southern Cross sealing disasters. Despite public opinion, nobody was held legally responsible, though the commission still found Abram Keene, Westbury Keene, and George Tuff all guilty of errors in judgment. This inquiry made it clear that sealers faced unnecessarily dangerous working conditions on the ice. In their report, the commission gave a few recommendations. 1. That the captains should be prohibited from ordering their crews so far from their ships that they could not return the same day. 2. Sealers should only work on the ice between sunrise and sunset. 3. All sealing ships should carry wireless equipment, thermometers, and barometers. And finally, sealers should not step on the ice without compasses, signaling equipment, and the means of providing fire. The commission also recommended that ship owners be made accountable for any injuries or deaths that were sustained by their crews. These recommendations, as well as prompting from the Fishermen's Protective Union, would lead to the government passing 26 articles into law in 1916. This new law made radios and flares mandatory on all sealing vessels. It also meant that sealers were prohibited from being on the ice after dark, and ship owners were also forced to pay out compensation for dead or injured sealers. This law also meant that doctors, pharmacists, and navigating officers became mandatory on many ships. Due to the belief that the Southern Cross sank due to overloading, it also became illegal for any ship to return from the hunt with more than 35,000 pelts. Sealing vessels should also be marked with load lines, and any ship returning to port with its load line below the water would receive a fine. For the families of the lost sealers, this offered little comfort. But at least the newly passed laws would ensure the safety of future sealers. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you all. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the video, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care.